Okay, so I want to welcome you to this workshop on active learning at Creighton University School of Medicine. We have, first I will tell you what the objectives are. We're going to, by the end of today, you should be able to explain how active learning is integrated into the curriculum here at Creighton. You'll be able to understand the structure of the cases used as pre-work for team-based learning activities. You'll be able to identify attributes of educationally sound cases. The cases we use are unique with respect to case-based learning, and they're you need to understand why we do what we do in the cases. And you'll also learn to create new and revise current cases that we have to enhance learning for students. And finally, you'll understand the principles and techniques needed to create effective assessment items. And we won't spend as much time on this. This is a whole lot of information for a fairly short period of time. We're probably going to get through it more quickly because there are few attendees, but that's okay. We'll work through them. Okay. That won't forward. There. Okay. We will be doing poll everywhere, but rather than actually, you can answer in poll everywhere, but there's only a couple of people attending, so we can just have a discussion when we come to those questions. So, passive versus active learning, what is the difference? Passive learning is used when students need to gain knowledge of stuff. And when I talk about stuff, I mean things where lowest level of Bloom's taxonomy is necessary, things that they need to remember, like the names of bones in the skeletal system, a number of anatomical structures. I would consider stuff because they don't make sense. You can't contextualize them unless you're in a clinical scenario, but you need to know the names. It's not something that you can understand the name on and take, say, the humerus. You can't take it someplace else and apply that name to something. So that would be stuff. So passive learning is okay. It's going to require rote memorization. Active learning is better for students who need to learn how to use that information and apply it to multiple scenarios. In education, we refer to this as transference, transferring knowledge from one situation to another situation. Active learning, therefore, requires that students are engaged and that they understand what it is they are interacting with in terms of the content. And both of these, both passive and active learning, have their place. At the level our students are at the School of Medicine, our students already know much of the foundational knowledge that they need to apply that information to becoming doctors. So while they do both have their place in medical school, there's very little passive learning that needs to occur. All right, so here is one of the first questions. So what is one word that comes to mind when you think of passive learning? Can you think of lecture? Dr. White, if you're on there, you can put something in the chat.
No, I was trying to think of one word, but I was gonna say, disinterested at times, but
disengaged, which is why active learning is called engaged learning. Disengaged, often distracted. Since the age of computers, we see more and more students who are shopping on Amazon during class. And faculty, we do have faculty who will call them out. A couple of weeks ago, we had one faculty go up to a student who was on their phone, and he said, "So are you buying me something?" And the student was really embarrassed. In any case, it's students do not need to be engaging with the information in passive learning. So what is one word that comes to mind when you think of active learning? Anybody? Involved, clearly involved, awake,
Dynamic.
another. All right, so we can identify when we walk into a classroom if students are learning passively or actively. And one of the ways we can do that, I have a picture coming up and you can see active learning. When we use active learning, we expect that the students will be able to assess their own degree of understanding, and they need to continually be considering what it is they're learning and how they're learning it, because they're listening to other people and they're trying to understand how these other people are learning what they're learning. And in this way, the students can develop skills to apply concepts to problems. Students also need to attain knowledge through participation and contribution. They ask questions more readily in active learning, and they can answer questions and are more comfortable doing so. And it also requires that they be mentally and often physically active in their learning. An opportunity for students to be physically active in their learning would be in clinical skills classes. You cannot learn some clinical skills without actually practicing. And some of you may have seen this before. I kind of like this slide. I see and I forget. I hear and I understand. I do and I remember. This dates back to Confucius thousands of years ago, but also today. Kids will never learn to tie their shoes unless they do it. They can't watch and do it. And when you think of how young children learn, they are always doing things to learn. And we kind of teach that out of them. Our education system is designed to teach active learning out of our students. We expect them to sit still in class, rows and columns of desks. And then they get to medical school and we want them to be active learners. And there's a reason that they struggle and that faculty struggle. Okay, so this is an image from a classroom at Creighton, and Dr. White probably recognizes this. This is when we started team-based learning, and I don't know why I do have newer pictures in our new active learning space, but this is how the students would do team-based learning, or how we would conduct team-based learning in a lecture hall. The students are turned around, they're more active, and obviously more engaged than they would be if somebody was standing up at the front lecturing. So principles of active learning. Learning involves active construction of meaning by the learner. So the student has to take the information that they are learning and put it into a schema that they've developed over years of education. They have to fit it into something that they understand. And by doing so, they create connections that will enable them to retrieve that information and put it into different contexts continually. They are learning facts and learning to do something, learning to do something with those facts are different processes. They use different areas of the brain. Some subject matter is context specific, other subject matter is more readily transferable and requires practice, such as the location of a bone in the body. We test things like that, but that is something that is specifically within the body. We can't transfer that knowledge to some other subject matter, but we can transfer knowledge of things like receptor activation by neurotransmitters and drugs that can alter the effects of those neurotransmitters. If it happens, we know how drugs act at receptors. They either activate, they block, they prevent reuptake of neurotransmitters. There are multiple ways, but if you know how that works in, say, the autonomic nervous system, you can figure out how receptors are going to be modified by drugs, or receptor activation is going to be modified by drugs in other contexts as well. Learning is more likely when individuals learn with other people. We know peer instruction, team-based learning works. There's evidence that it is highly superior to passive learning, to lecture alone. And meaningful learning is facilitated when students have to explain what it is they've learned. And this is why in team-based learning, faculty should not talk. They should be calling on students to explain. If one team asks a question, the faculty shouldn't answer it. They should defer to another team and say, okay, can you explain why you answered something, or what might be an alternative explanation to what the first team answered. This way you can eventually guide the student teams to discerning where you wanted them to be without lecturing, and the students will learn better that way. They will retain that information. So here's another question. Is there ever a time when passive learning would be better than active learning? And if so, when? And again, you don't need to answer. I think I've used an example over and over. A time when passive learning is superior, when students are in the anatomy lab learning structures. You know, the relationship between structures.
Can we say that, you know, that's maybe better?
Passive learning, I think, is better than sometimes when it's just, you know, basic information that the student may not have to recall, but maybe foundational things that may be better than active.
Right. An example that I can think of from my experience is the cranial nerves. 12 cranial nerves. How do people learn the names of the cranial nerves? There are a zillion mnemonics out there to help students do that. I would think that's passive learning. You're not really applying anything yet, but you need to know those cranial nerves, because for some reason faculty keep testing on the names of the cranial nerves rather than on the function or the their relevance to life. All right, so at Creighton, we have integrated active learning across the curriculum. We are continually wanting to expand this. And this began, well, I guess in 2018. The new curriculum started in the fall of 2019, and it consisted primarily of CBL, TBL modules. That was the new innovation. We created integrated course blocks rather than individual topic courses. You know, we don't have biomedical sciences, or we don't have genetics. We don't teach pharmacology separately from everything else. All of the course blocks are integrated by systems primarily. We use CBL TBLs. The curriculum was originally designed to have a CBL TBL duo on Wednesday afternoon, Thursday morning, Friday morning for CBL, then TBL to follow, with a TBL standalone on Monday. So a Monday TBL to kind of introduce the students to the week. Organically, that has changed. One of the limitations we've found is that we are limited with the number of cases that we have. We have plans to move to using, in one capstone course in the second year, entirely CBL TBLs for the entire 4 or 5 weeks. So they would do 4 or 5 CBL TBL modules a week, and then one terminal assessment, but it would all be active learning. That's an aspiration of mine, of ours. So CBL TBL modules, anatomy TBLs we've got, that's active learning. Laboratory sessions, we've always had. Audience response, we use Poll Everywhere at a fairly high rate, and it's included in some of the information that we provide for faculty if they want to do more active learning. We do have an institutional account for Poll Everywhere, which allows faculty to have 1,000 responses rather than the 40 that a free account will provide. Peer instruction, this is a really powerful mode of active learning. It's one that came out of physics. Eric Mazer at MIT developed this method, and it's another powerful one. It takes a lot of effort collectively by faculty. It involves writing a lot of multiple choice questions and making sure that they are valid and that they actually provide information that students are able to take away by answering just questions in class. And then games is another option. There are others as well. The way our CBL, TBL curriculum works is it's a 2-day learning cycle. The first day is the pre-work day. TBL, and this pre-work is for the team-based learning activity. The students experience in their small groups of 5 to 7 students a case that is put into Blue Line. It should take about 90 minutes to 2 hours for them to go through the case. It is completely self-directed, unlike problem-based learning where you have faculty involved in the case. This is student-directed. The case itself and the specific references and links are provided. We have enhanced the cases significantly over the last 3.5 years to engage the students more with the information and to provide them additional information than what the original cases did. So we've revamped some of them. And then on day 2, the team-based learning activity, and this is really the goal of our active learning. It involves a number of different there are a number of different parts to team-based learning, and all of them are important. But what we do in the classroom is the readiness assurance process, which includes an individual readiness assessment test and a team readiness assessment test. The individual readiness assessment test holds individual students accountable for having been engaged with the case and learning from the case. They're assessed, that is graded, the IRAT is graded. The TRAT holds individual students accountable to their teammates, to their peers when they're answering the questions. So that also is graded. And finally, the goal of the CBL, TBL modules is the application exercises. And these are exercises that are ungraded. We like to have anywhere, depending on the course block, 2 to 5 of these at, following the TRAT. And these are opportunities for students to take the information, the material that they've learned from the cases and from discussion during the TRAT, take it and apply it to more significant, novel, complex problems that allow them to transfer that information to a different context. So these should be considerably difficult. I always tell faculty the difference between the questions on the IRAT, TRAT and the application exercises is that the IRAT, TRAT questions should be easily answered from the pre-work. You might be able to Google those answers. Application exercises should be so complex that the students could not enter the question and get an answer and be able to explain it on Google. So Googleable and non-Googleable. All right. So team-based learning provides a plan for the classroom. I often refer to team-based learning, actually in general, is often referred to as the first flipped classroom. And flipped classrooms need to be considerably more than putting PowerPoints online for the students to review the night before and then having them come and ask, and the faculty member asking questions. If you've ever been in the classroom and you ask a question and just generally to the students, nobody will answer. And because faculty don't like quiet time in the classroom, they will answer. After 10 or 15 seconds of dead space, Faculty will answer that's not really active learning for the students, even though it is technically a flipped classroom. The students have to be accountable and engaged. So team-based learning provides a plan for the classroom, for the flipped classroom. The students are required to do the pre-work, whether it's the case or it could be research articles, voiceover PowerPoints, videos, clinical experiences, readings. Other experiences can be the pre-work. In our TBL or CBL TBL modules, it's the case and any references associated with that. The readiness assurance process then holds the students accountable for doing the pre-work because they're graded on the IRAT, TRAT, and then the application exercises are how they use that knowledge. So we do CBL, TBL modules, then we use standalone TBLs. We do a lot of these in anatomy over the last 2 years. We've increased anatomy TBL numbers to about 3 a week in some course blocks. So that's significant. In fall of 2019, we didn't use any TBL in anatomy. So that's an expansion. So here, team-based learning is the original flipped classroom. What makes TBL unique as a flipped classroom? And this is kind of a really bad question because the answers are pretty similar. First, students are accountable for the pre-work. Second, faculty facilitate discussion between teams of students. Third, students use knowledge gained from pre-work to solve complex novel problems. And fourth, individual team members are accountable to their peers. And I'm going to do a really bad thing and just explain these because each of them are important and make team-based learning unique. The most important, which would you, so all of these are important and make team-based learning unique, but which one would you think is the most important in terms of student learning?
I think the last one.
Right. Individual team members accountable to their peers.
Every Thursday, it's designed.
And Thursdays. Right. The individual team members, if they were only accountable to faculty, wouldn't care. But being accountable to their peers is important. And for that reason, because we've had some dysfunctional teams over the years, and I've come to realize that it's because team-based learning also requires peer evaluation. Students are allowed to assess their peers. I did not I don't know the premise for the original plan, but students were doing peer evaluations twice. Once in at the end of foundations, once at the end, like at Christmas time, and then not again. So that's not really feedback because their peers are not getting significant feedback. So I switched it. Now we just have to get the students on board with completing them, but we're doing it every block, every course block, at the end of every course block, because these teams are permanent. And if the course block is 5 weeks or longer, we'll do it twice, once in the middle of the block and once at the end. And this way, the students are even more accountable to their peers. And they're pretty honest with each other in this narrative feedback. So that's right. But all of them, students in general, are accountable because they will do the pre-work because they don't want to look foolish. Faculty facilitation between teams of students is important because faculty should not ever explain a question. At the end of a team-based learning session, they can summarize and pull everything together, but the student teams should have such rich discussion with faculty facilitating and asking teams different opinions and leading. They can lead. What do you think about this this concept, to one team, and then another team can explain the same thing. And then students applying this to novel problems. That's kind of the goal. And we will see growth in things like clinical decision-making, which we have not been explicit enough about in our curriculum, even though all of our cases are clinical decision-making cases. At the end of first year, our students don't think that they have learned anything about clinical decision-making. So we're going to be more explicit about that part of the curriculum. And case-based learning is pre-work. And these teams of 5 to 7 students are permanent teams. They're in the cases and in the TBL teams in these, and this is why peer evaluation is significant, because they are accountable to their teammates. And it introduces students to patient scenarios, promotes clinical reasoning and decision-making, and it introduces concepts and subject matter that are not necessarily covered in other class sessions. And that's okay. That's what we want to do. We want to take the information that faculty feel they need to lecture on and put it into things like cases, because the important aspects are going to come out. The important content is going to come out, and it's a much better way for students to learn this. And then this is the timeline. You can see the on the far left, individual preparation or contextual didactics are the beginning of this active learning cycle. Then the students do a case. The integrated case takes about 120 minutes. Team-based learning, readiness assurance, individual and team readiness assurance tests, and then the application exercises. And as you can see from this, the case should last about 2 hours. We should spend, I should change that, 30 to 45 minutes on the IRAT, TRAT, and then 60 to 90 minutes on the application exercises. Some faculty just want to get through it, and we have to that's why we're doing things like this. And you can see that the red there doesn't show up. We're moving for our students from a lower level of Bloom's taxonomy, which is the remembering level, up through an evaluating and creating level. So they're able to apply, analyze, evaluate, and create as they move through this. They get the content initially through the case and through readings, and then they are ultimately, during application exercises, able to apply that. So I'm just going to show a case here. And this, all right, so this is the case as it appears in blue line for the students. And the discussion board is underneath here. Here's how the students access the case. And I'm going to show you a couple of panels from the student's view, but then I'll switch to what I call the easy view, because it is easier to go through the whole thing at once. So student view. There we go. Okay. And we title each case, we provide a title. This is Along for the Ride. And because we don't want them to have the diagnosis prior to the case. So, I'm at the back. I'm going to start over here. Okay. So the case, it starts with, back here, I'm going to exit out here, leave. I'm just going to start at the beginning so you can see how the case works. Okay, so it begins with a vignette and discussion questions. And there are a series of vignettes, usually 8 to 10, that take the student from first introduction to the patient or to the situation. And it's not a H&P, it is a vignette that from the patient's perspective generally, and the students work their way through the clinical decision-making that would typically occur by a physician or by a healthcare provider. So In this case, the patient presents, he's spina bifida, he's 28 years old, has particular problems at the moment, and it takes students through, they begin to see things like ultrasound images, graphics that help you understand what the patient like. It's amazing what images do. We can integrate diversity by just putting images of patients. If we didn't include images, students are going to develop their own narrative about a patient. So we can do this and help guide them. We provide things like ultrasound images. So that is vignette. These discussion questions will address the objectives of the case. The students don't get to the objectives until the very end of the case, again, because we don't want them to, we want to mask the diagnosis. We want them to work through it. So these questions students answer in their teams. Only one of the team members has access to the case initially. And then so they answer these questions and then they go to the next. And following the vignettes and discussion questions, the students will come to an advancement question. An advancement question is always answered on the next page, but at this point, the students have to stop and actually enter an answer before they can move to the next one. I've disabled this on here for this so that I don't have to answer anything. But those are application or advancement questions. Then they move on. There's another vignette. At the beginning of the next vignette, this advancement question is answered. Okay. And then again, more discussion questions. We began including links in all of our cases. The students love them. What it does is it introduces the students to textbooks and other resources that are useful, and it gets them looking at, for example, JAMA articles. It gets them looking at academic medicine or other textbooks outside of the ones that they have typically used. So another vignette and another advancement question. So at this point, I'm going to leave student view and get to a view where I can just skip through all of these quickly. So here is the formatting. Our faculty will say, yeah, the case is ready to go. We get an okay. And the instructional designers format this, put it in here, make sure all of the links are working. There's advancement question. Here's another vignette. We introduced checkpoint questions, and I think we're going to change the names of these to clinical decision-making questions or clinical decision points. These checkpoint questions have two purposes. They allow individual students to answer a question without input from their peers. And they do this on Poll Everywhere. All of our students have registered Poll Everywhere accounts, and it's actually will be a good way to provide formative feedback for students, because we can pull the results of these and see which students answered correctly and which ones didn't. We have not done that to this point. We just giving them the opportunity to take them out of the case. So each of these checkpoint questions takes them out of the case, but to a related scenario. So they're learning that they can transfer the knowledge that they have to something different. Rather than being linear within the case, we're taking them out and providing them the opportunity to see how what they have already discussed applies in a different case. So we do this. We go back and forth about whether or not we want to start providing or making these worth something, like maybe a quarter of a point. That's just been a big discussion for about 2.5 years. And I don't know whether we'll ever come to a decision on that. In any case, they go through vignette discussion or vignette with discussion question, advancement questions, or checkpoint questions. There are usually 3 to 5 checkpoint questions in every case, but they take the place of advancement questions. And it goes on, there's another checkpoint, and till we get to the epilogue. There's always an epilogue where it kind of summarizes everything. It closes the vignette for the patient, or for the student. It closes the patient scenarios. Sometimes the patient dies. Sometimes it's a happy ending. Sometimes there's, it's left kind of, students are left hanging. We're hoping in some of the cases, I would like to see us come back, revisit some of these cases in a more complicated, with a more complex eye at the case later on. Again, that might be something that we can do in our multi-system disease and clinical decision-making course. And then the students get the learning objectives at the end, and all of the references and answers to the checkpoint questions are provided because the students want to know what the correct answer is, as medical students do. They want to know the correct answers, which is, clinical decision-making. It's really difficult to move our students away from having to know the right answer all the time. Okay, so that is the case. And I am going to, there we go, get back to the slideshow. Hopefully everybody can see the slideshow. Good, thank you. All right, so case, and you can, we will provide these slides so you can access it. You might not have access to the Blue Line course unless you are actually in that particular course, and MSK or MSI. But that's why I wanted to run through this with you briefly. So you've been asked to teach an active learning session on neurotransmitter receptors of the ANS. What is the first thing you do? A, find the most appropriate resources from which students will learn. B, decide which active learning method you will use. C, decide what the students will be able to do after the session. D, modify a PowerPoint presentation from last year to make it pre-work. And E, talk to other faculty who might have already prepared such a session. Now, this I really want to find out what people think. Any idea? Which? E, C? Right. Great answers, because that one, all of these are really good and you can do them, but unless you know what the objectives for the session are, you can't do any of the rest to the degree you need to. Talking to other faculty is a really good idea once you know what it is you want to teach, and then you can pull things, from previous presentations. You can go out and look for resources for the students, and you can decide which active learning method. Every active learning method is amenable to helping you or helping our students reach the objectives you want to take them to. So that is, we always start with the end in mind, with the objectives. Okay, where do we want to end up? Where do we want our students to end up, more importantly? Yeah, backward design. Okay, so the framework for writing cases at Creighton, it's usually the block directors who provide the learning objectives. More frequently, the block directors get the idea that they want to teach a particular topic. And then we have to talk to them about, okay, what is it you need the students to know? And The learning objectives directly then relate to discussion, advancement, and checkpoint questions. We've been revising a number of cases over the last couple of years. And what we will do is look at the objectives and make sure that the objectives actually address what is in the case, because the early writing of the cases sometimes didn't do that. So we will either change the objectives or we'll go in and make alterations to the case. And we now have a dedicated director for case review and revision. And she this year worked really hard with all of the first year, the M1 cases, and she will be moving to work with all of the M2 cases, which is where we really need a lot more help, because the M2 cases, we've focused so much always on the first year students, because they're, of course, were the first ones in the new curriculum, and then the pandemic hit and the second year kind of got neglected, I have to say. Anyway, the narrative guides learners through the clinical vignette. They last 90 to 120 minutes. And I do have handouts, and I will provide those as a link with the PowerPoints as well. Lost there. Okay, so finally, the last item before we move on to some hands-on things, and that's going to be difficult to do. We're kind of spread out. But one best answer item, multiple choice questions. There are two types of multiple choice questions. One is like true or false. That's multiple choice. And the other type is one best answer items. All right. We always want to construct multiple choice questions where, although many of the answers may be correct, there is one that is best, like in that previous one, about what do you want students to be able to do? All of them are good, but that is where you need to start. So that is a good example. And these multiple choice questions are used throughout the curriculum. In quizzes, exams, readiness assurance tests, application exercises, checkpoint questions, MBME exams, and our M1s are coming up to their first MBME exam in 2 weeks, where they will be exposed to a number of specifically written questions, well-formatted questions that we want to, the style of which we want to emulate with all of our questions. And just to break down some of what a multiple choice question is, the STEM is the question itself, and it may include background information. It may serve to contextualize and situate the question for the student. We want these questions to begin wherever possible with a vignette, something that puts the question in context and allows the student to be able to understand the point of view of the question. The answer options, as the previous question I asked about where do you start, there is a single best answer, but all should be plausible. And this is where writing questions for peer instruction is so difficult, because in one academic year, one medical school that uses peer instruction along with team-based learning, they used, or I think it was in the first 2 years that they introduced peer instruction, they used 5,000 multiple choice questions in their classroom. And that's a lot of questions. And they actually had a multiple choice question writing team or question reviewing team that that would review every question and send them back to faculty to rewrite if they were not good questions. Multiple choice questions can be harmful to students if they're not well written. So the options also need to be clear and unambiguous, and avoid phrases like it could be something, or we might do this, or, you have to make sure it's very clear. And if you have ever had students argue a question, it's usually because of the ambiguity in the question. And that is faculty's responsibility to make sure that that doesn't happen. And there are two bits of information we can get from historically, from each iteration of use of a test question and an exam or a quiz or a RAT. And this is the point by serial correlation. What this does is it correlates student responses to a single question with the student's overall grade on an assessment, and it will actually dig deeper and look at correlation of what the class as a whole answered for each answer option, and compare it to the rest of the class. The scale is -1 to +1. And we get these from ExamSoft. Into Dashboard, which is our team-based learning platform, provides us with point by serial and the next one, Discrimination Index. And you can see here there are 8 students, 3 items on an assessment. It tells you how the students did on the assessment. Item 3, everybody got it correct. Item 2, everybody got it incorrect. And then the item 1, the first 4 people got it correct, last 4 people got it incorrect. And what it does is it takes that information and compares how each of those students did on the whole assessment. And it provides, there's a p-value, and then it provides the point by serial. And you can see item 1 has a very high point by serial, 0.91. Remember, the highest is +1. That means it's a really good indicator that that question could actually discriminate between students who did well on the entire exam and students who did poorly on the entire exam. Okay. Question 2, or item 2, has a -0.91 point by serial, which means, in fact, that the students who did poorly on the whole exam were probably getting it correct more often than the students who did well on the exam, which means that the students who prepared the least were doing better than the students who prepared the most, which is, we don't want. So a negative point by serial, especially one of 0.91, you either have to drastically alter the question or get rid of it completely. Okay. And then 0 is kind of neutral. I would look at it because I think questions should have some discrimination between students who do well and students who don't. But it's not bad. 0.91 is horrible. And then the next item way that we can analyze is actually the discrimination index. And what this does is it divides the students on any question into quartiles. The upper, the whole group, it shows the whole group, and then percent correct, the upper 25% of students on the entire test. It tells how many of them got that question correct, and it tells you how many students who are at the lower end for the entire test got it correct. You can see the discrimination index for question 2, I guess I put these on backwards, is -0.6. And in this case, 54 students got this question correct, 27 answered B, but the lower quartile of students, more of that quartile got it correct than the upper quartile. So it's got a negative discrimination index, also something we don't want to see. Okay. And in the first question, you can see that the upper 25% of students for the entire assessment, 97 students got it correct, the lower 56 got it correct, and it changes the tally frequency. Discrimination index is positive, so that's a good question as well. So that's the information we can get from good questions. And when we look at comparability between campuses, we really should be looking at everything all together, because these might be different between the campuses, but that doesn't mean that the question is bad. It means we need to be looking at the full picture. And so we need to work around, or we need to figure out how to deal with that, because it's just something that it just occurred to me that in addition to all of the data we get comparing campuses, we need to look at the overall so that we're not throwing out good questions because maybe a topic wasn't covered on one. Okay. So that's just a thought that I had. So multiple choice questions should be well constructed and do no harm to student learning. What can be done when creating an assessment with multiple choice questions to ensure that they are good questions? When I say do no harm, if you've ever seen the effort and the cognitive load put on students by a question that is ambiguous, especially medical students, they spend more time focusing on one question in assessment because they feel that that it was ambiguous. That's what it always comes down to. And it does harm. And especially as they're taking an assessment, if they come to a question that is ambiguous, they're going to fret over a question because it is poorly written. And that's not a good place for students to be when they're taking an exam. Anyway, back to this question. What can be done when creating an assessment to ensure that they're good questions? The stem should be only a single sentence in length. Answer options should include distractors that are plausible and unambiguous. The point by serial and discrimination index should both be negative. We know that's not true. This is a bad question because that is so clearly not true. It's not plausible. If you know what you do. If you know what you do. I mean, it is. And I did not intend for this to be a super good question. I just wanted you to start thinking about, first of all, looking at discrimination index and point by serial, because those are important analytics for questions, and use the questions that have been used for the last 10 years. Again, not a serious option, because the ones that have been used for the last 10 years, very many of them need to be repaired. And I find it interesting that faculty like to hang on to questions because they have so many years of analytics on them, but the analytics are not what, I don't know if they're hoping that they will suddenly become really good, but you know, we need to look at these. So what would be the
B is the correct choice here.
Right? Thank you. I got carried away a little.
That's okay. It's good.
I just there are some things that are historic and it's kind of uphill. But anyway, answer questions. Answer multiple choice questions is one of those areas. So right, answer options should include distractors that are plausible and unambiguous. And we have a difficult enough time getting faculty to submit questions, let alone to write questions, write brand new questions, or to change older questions. And I can't imagine having 5,000 questions that have to be really good presented to students over a 2-year. We actually developed a case and a team-based learning activity with the case where the students write questions. They spend the time and then they critique each other's questions. And it's interesting because the students say, that's really hard. That's really hard. We do have them write questions and it's probably one of the most complex team-based learning application activities that we have, is having the student teams write questions. But this is a really good resource. MBME has item writing workshops online fairly regularly. I think it's about $350. And I think the School of Medicine would be errant not to support faculty who are interested in writing good questions. How can we help you to feel more confident in your ability to engage and facilitate learning for the students in any way, either planning sessions, writing questions, engaging yourself in more active learning? There are opportunities, there are conferences all over frequently. Many of them are virtual now, which makes it easy and much less expensive to engage, but we truly want to know how we can help. Jessica's going to share the continuing CE credit information. What I have here, and this is Dr. White, I'm sorry, I didn't post any of these on the link, but I can send you all of this information. What I've got on the tables are, first of all, some guides. One is key points for faculty writing and participating in case-based learning modules at Creighton. And it kind of goes through the steps that are needed and what needs to be done when faculty are writing new cases, or even, and I use the term repairing our old cases. It's not that they're really bad, they just need some repair. And then a Creighton guide to case-based learning and a Creighton guide to team-based learning.